Oh, guys, honestly, it's such a privilege to be again speaking this morning. We are continuing our series on heroes of faith. So we've looked at David, we've looked at Abraham, and this morning we are looking at Peter. And I absolutely love Peter. I feel like Peter, as you read about his life in the scriptures, is the most relatable person there is in the scriptures. I'm like, doesn't matter what number you are on the Enneagram, doesn't matter what your Myers-Briggs is, I think we can all relate to Peter. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at three aspects of Peter's life and his character, and we're simply just going to ask, can those three things really speak to us and our lives? So the first thing I want us to think about this morning is that Peter was radical. Peter was radical. He had in him this really radical spirit, and I want us to kind of grasp that this morning. And we get a clue to this in the very first time that we meet Peter in the scriptures. So the first time we come across him is when we are stood by the shore, and Peter and his brother are out on the boat fishing. It's what they do. And then Jesus comes and he says to them this. He says, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for men." Now, the first time we get a clue to just how radical Peter is his response to that invitation. It says, at once they left their nets and followed him. At once. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody came up to me and said, "Tim, I want you to just leave your livelihood, what you do every day, and instead I want you to do this," the chances are I would consider it. I'd get my spreadsheet out. I'd be like, oh, these are the pros, these are the cons. I'd weigh it all up. I'd look at the finances. I'd weigh it all up. I'd spend a lot of time praying. I'd talk to my wife. I'd do what she tells me anyway. And then I may or may not do it. But Peter and his brother at once laid down their nets and accepted that invitation from Jesus. I think that gives us a first clue that Peter is radical. He's got this radical spirit against him. The second clue that we get about Peter's radical spirit is that famous story where Peter ends up walking on water. And in recent years, there's actually been a little bit of footage uncovered, a little bit like the scrolls that were found. And it turns out that we actually had technology 2,000 years ago called the iPhone. And we've actually got some pictures of Peter walking on the water that are going to come up any minute. Or yeah, there we go. So this is the original footage of Peter walking on water. For the benefit of the podcast, it's my child attempting to run on water, obviously. So what happened in this moment? How did Peter end up there? Well, Jesus had been speaking to a big crowd, and he sent the disciples out onto the lake. He said, "Guys, you go out on the lake. I'm going to go up and pray on my own on this mountainside." And then they're out on the lake, and then this is what it says. Matthew 14, starting at verse 25. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Now, I want you to put yourselves in Peter's position for a moment. Peter's on this boat with the other guys. It's dawn, it's getting dark, and they look out and they see in the distance this figure, and it looks like a ghost, and they're scared and they're terrified. But then this voice comes back, and they feel like, oh, hang on, I recognize this voice. I recognize this voice. And they hear the voice of Jesus saying, take courage, don't fear, it is me. And I want you to listen to what Jesus said. What Peter said in response. 12 guys were on the boat, and Peter says this, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out on the water. And then he hears the response from Jesus. Come. And then Peter got down out of the boat and he stepped on the water, knowing full well that the law of nature means that he is going to sink. Knowing full well that all physics and science means that he is going to go through that water. And yet, his foot plants and he feels the resistance. And then his other foot goes out onto the water. And he begins to take some steps towards Jesus. Isn't that just incredible? But then, verse 30, he saw the wind, he saw the waves, and he was afraid, and he began to sink. And then he cried out, Lord, save me. Lord, save me. And then it says that immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. Isn't it amazing that even in the failure, even in the moment of getting it wrong, of having the faith disappear and beginning to sink, what's beautiful is he got to experience the arm of rescue from Jesus, right? He got to experience that, even in the failure. And then presumably, he was held up by Jesus and they're stood in the middle of a lake. So I guess he got to experience walking back to the boat in the arms of Jesus. So even in his failure, what did he get? Well, he got intimacy with Jesus. And then after that, he got a stern talking to. Jesus said to him, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And I'm thinking, I thought Peter did pretty well, Jesus. I thought he did all right. He walked a couple of steps on water. That's better than everyone else in the history of humanity. I think he's doing quite well. But you know what? I think Jesus had more belief in Peter. I think he believed so much in Peter. He knew that there was so much more for him, yeah? He knew there was more available for him. He believed in Peter so much. Now, I want to think about the other 11 guys for a minute. The other 11 were safe on the boat. But you know, I would much rather experience something with Jesus. I'd much rather step out. I'd much rather make some mistakes and be rescued by him. I'd much rather him pick me up and give me a little bit of a talking to, because do you know what? He's like, there's more for you, Tim. I would much rather that. And Peter got to experience that because of his radical spirit. He had this radical spirit that allowed him to take that step. The third and final example of Peter being super radical was this. As the evening where Jesus was going to get arrested before being taken to the cross, Jesus turned to Peter and he said, truly, you are going to deny me 3 times. And guess what Peter's response was? He was like, even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. Radical Peter, spoiler alert, we're going to look at it later. He definitely did deny Jesus. But he had that radical spirit within him. And this morning, I want us to think about the options that we have when it comes to following Jesus. I think each of us here, we've got 3 choices. Choice number 1 is we can reject him. We can say, no, I don't want to know. I don't believe he exists. I don't think this is true, and I reject it. That's one of the options we've got when we think about Jesus. The other option is that we become an observer of Jesus. And so we become a little bit like the guys on the boat. We're looking at something and we're interested and we're kind of half involved, we're nearby. And what does that look like? Well, maybe that looks like I know some of the stories, I come to church, I hear about it, I'm looking at people's lives and I'm interested, but essentially I'm an observer of Jesus, and it's kind of a little bit safe. And that's another option that we have. But the third option that we have is to receive the invitation that Jesus says, and we follow him. We become a follower of him and his ways. We become an apprentice who looks and listens to Jesus and wants to join in with whatever he is doing. And I believe that that is the radical choice that we can make. I believe that is what Peter did. And that is why Peter got to experience all of these extraordinary things, the highs and the lows, because he wanted to be a follower. He wanted to make those radical choices. And the more I kind of follow Jesus, the more I am convinced that I would much rather go for it and make mistakes and mess up and receive his lifting up and receive his embrace. I'd much rather that than to just play it safe. Look at a distance. Do the right things, but hold it all at arm's length. And I really believe this morning that God is wanting us. God is wanting some of you in particular to say today, I want to make a radical choice like Peter. I want to embrace that radical spirit like Peter did. And I don't know what that might look like for you and for your life. But maybe it's like you've had something in you thinking, I need to start this business. And it's going to have Jesus' values at the center. And maybe today's the day where you go, yeah, do you know what? I'm going to go for it. It might go wrong. It might fall apart in a year. But I'm going to go for it. Or maybe there's a situation at work that you've been aware of for so long, and you know that it needs confronting. You know that it needs calling out, but it's a little bit scary. And maybe today's the day where you think, do you know what? I need to make that radical choice as his follower, and I need to call it out. I need to confront it and face the consequences. Or maybe God's saying to you this morning, I want you to completely change the direction of your life. And I want you to foster. Or I want you to start the adoption process. I don't know. I've got no idea what it might be. But these radical choices are exciting. They're an adventure. Maybe God's saying, do you know what you need to do? You need to join the street team at church. You need to be part of that team that goes out on the street every week, speaks to strangers, and invites them to Alpha. Maybe he's saying the radical thing for you to do is to go and invite that friend to Alpha or to church that you are 95% sure will say no. And I want you to go and invite them anyway. Yeah, it's a radical choice. I think God wants some of us to do some radical things and follow in Peter's example. As I was preparing this bit, I really felt like I want to speak to the men in the room for a moment. And please don't hear me wrong. This is not to exclude women. That's not my heart, so please hear that. But I think there might just be some men in the room who think that like following Jesus is this safe, dull existence. And I want to say to you, that is so far from the truth. And God wants you to take the invitation to follow him really seriously. And I promise you, it will be an adventure. And it won't be safe, and it won't be dull. We've got 3 young men in our church, Ethan, Ben, and Jordan. And in the last couple of months, they've all come to me separately. And they've said, Tim, I think I'm going to go. And I'm going to go and plant that church in Blackburn. I'm going to join the team. And a big part of me is like, oh no, I love you guys. I'm like, oh no, we're gonna miss you so much. But actually, I'm like, yes, you get it. You get it. You want to make that radical choice. You want to go to Blackburn. No, I didn't mean that. You want to go to Blackburn and you want to plant this new thing. And you want to stand up in front of a school when you haven't got a clue what you're doing and give an assembly. And you want to be part of it. You've said yes to that radical invitation. And I think we just need men and women to choose that for sure. So that's the first thing that I think we can learn from Peter's life. We can be radical like he was. Now, the second thing that I think we learn from Peter's life is that he was redeemed. He was redeemed. I want to take you to the night that Jesus got arrested. Now, remember Peter's bold claim? I'll never deny you. I'd rather die. Let me tell you what happened. Peter was pretty cowardly, and he was close enough to where he knew all the action was, but far enough away where he felt a little bit safe. And he found himself stood around this fire, warming himself by the fire. And not one, not two, but 3 different people all came to him saying, hang on, didn't you know that guy? Hang on, weren't you one of his followers? No, it's not me. No, you've got it wrong. It's definitely not me. 3 times, Peter denied even knowing Jesus. And then the cockerel crowed, and he remembered what Jesus said. Now just take yourself into that moment with Peter. Peter's world has just crumbled. He has spent 3 years following Jesus. He's got all of his hopes and his dreams mixed up in this man. And he's been arrested, and he's going to go to the cross, and he's going to die. And on top of that, he then denies even knowing him 3 times. I'm not sure there's a lower moment, but that's what he's feeling. Now let's fast forward a few days. The resurrection happens. And he meets the resurrected Jesus. He actually sees Jesus in resurrected form. I mean, how can a human brain even take in what that is and what is happening there? And I'm sure he's like overwhelmed, overjoyed, full of confusion. And this happens a couple of times, but then Jesus goes again. And I think Peter must just be going around thinking, oh man, like, what now? What's the plan? What are we doing? What are we doing next? But do you know, I think there's something else going on in Peter's mind. And actually, there's something going on deep in the pit of Peter's stomach. I think he's thinking, I denied even knowing him. I said I would die for him, and I couldn't even admit that I knew him. And he's thinking, does Jesus know? He's thinking, what would he think of me? I'm such a coward. I'm such a failure. And I think he's carrying around this feeling in the pit of his stomach. And then we read the story where he's out on the lake fishing. And I find that quite intriguing. I'm sort of thinking, I wonder if he just thought, what do I do now? Well, I'll go and fish like I did before. And he's out on the lake, and then Jesus appears to him for the 3rd time. And he calls him in. He says, guys, come in, let's have some breakfast, bring the fish. And they light a barbecue. And in the early dawn, in the early morning, he's warming himself by the barbecue. And he feels the heat on his hands. And he smells the smoke. And he's got that little bit of a taste in the back of his throat of the smoke. And he's thinking, I remember the last time I was stood like this. I denied Jesus 3 times. And Jesus says to him, Peter, do you love me? He says, yeah, you know I love you. Peter, do you love me? Yeah, you know I love you. Jesus says a third time, Peter, do you love me? Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Do you see what Jesus was doing? He was redeeming Peter. He was reversing what had happened. He was bringing Peter back into the fullness. You may have denied me 3 times, but I forgive you, I love you, and you are redeemed in me. Now, each and every one of us need to know the redeeming love of Jesus, just like Peter. But maybe this morning there's 1 or 2 of you who are thinking, you know, I can really relate to that feeling that Peter had. You're thinking to yourself, yeah, Tim, but if you really knew what I was like, if you really knew what I did, then you would know that I'm excluded from this. And I want to say to you this morning, that is not true. Jesus can redeem you like he redeemed Peter. And I really want you to grasp that this morning. So we learn from Peter the radical way of life. We learn from Peter that we can be redeemed. And the third thing that we learn from Peter is that he was a rock. Jesus was walking along with his disciples one day. And he said to his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they start replying. They say, some say you're John the Baptist. Others say you're Elijah. Still others say you're Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And then Jesus turns to to the disciples, and he says, who do you say I am? And I can imagine this moment where all the disciples look at each other like, they've seen Jesus do these things. They've seen him miracles. They've heard his teaching. Jesus has asked them directly, who do you say I am? And of course, it's Peter. It's radical Peter who has the guts to say something first. And Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And listen to how Jesus responds. He said, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. That's Peter. That's another story. We'll come to that. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Wow. Jesus says to Peter, I'm going to build my church on you. Now, if I was choosing a rock to build on, I'm not sure I'd choose someone like Peter, who is a little bit erratic, that would say things before he thinks. Actually, I wouldn't build it on any human being because we are all so blatantly flawed, right? Isn't it good news that Jesus chose an ordinary guy like Peter to build this extraordinary movement called the church upon? Isn't it amazing that this thing that turned the world upside down, the church, he said, I'm going to build it on you. And I think again this morning that's an invitation that God has for us. He's saying to some of you this morning, I want you to be a rock. I want to build something upon you. Maybe you've been a Christian a long time. Maybe you've done some of the hard yards. Maybe you've gone through those hard life lessons. You've made those mistakes. You really know what it's like to follow Jesus for a long time. And maybe God's saying to you this morning, I want to build something on you. There are so many things that he could want to build. Maybe he wants to build a family unit on you, and he wants you to be the rock that holds it. And he says, I want to give you everything so you can be the rock for that family. Maybe he's saying to you, I want you to gather some people and I want you to journey with them through life. I want you to disciple them. I want you to be the rock. Maybe you're at uni and you're thinking, God's saying, I want you to be the rock upon which I build that student house. Maybe he's saying, I want you to be the rock that's going to do something that's going to help transform this city in my name. I don't know what it might be, but I think God wants you, some of us here, to be a rock. So what do we learn from Peter's life? Well, we learn that Peter was radical, he was redeemed, and he was a rock. And I think for us this morning, there's an invitation. There's an invitation to choose the radical way. There's an invitation to receive the redemption. And there's an invitation to be a rock for God to build something on.